Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. This time we're looking at a couple of big incidents in Richard III's reign and considering why he is seen as more of a failure compared to Edward IV's reputation of success. So the first issue that we need to kind of address is the princes in the Tower. Are the princes in the Tower? Maybe. You'll remember that when Richard arrived in London on the 4th of May 1483, he had installed Edward V straight away in the Tower of London, and that this wasn't particularly ominous by contemporary accounts, because that's where royals often stayed, and that's certainly where kings stayed before their coronation. In the middle of June, his brother Richard joined him after Mother Elizabeth Woodville had given him up to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that was pretty much the last anyone ever saw of them. They were almost certainly murdered, probably that autumn, but we just don't know. It's certainly true that late July, Richard and his wife Anne were on procession around the country, and they heard of a plot to free the two boys, and therefore to rebel against Richard. People involved weren't particularly significant or high profile, and the plot was easily foiled. But probably this meant that Richard kind of started to think about, best to get rid of them rather than leave them there as a symbol of revolt. The problem for historians lies in the lack of contemporary accounts. The only one from the time is from an Italian, Dominic Mancini, who was visiting London at the time on a diplomatic mission. It's not clear how much English he spoke or who he talked to. And even he isn't able to be certain that Edward V had been killed, and certainly isn't able to pinpoint who had done it. The Crowland Chronicle was written 3 years later. The London Chronicle was not written until the 16th century. That, incidentally, along with 2 contemporary sources from France, all say that Buckingham killed the boys, and that they claim that view was widespread at the time. We'll come back to that perhaps. But certainly Buckingham had been a big supporter of Richard in the early part of his reign. Polydore Virgil researched his history of England during Henry VII's reign, of course an opponent of Richard III, published it in the early years of Henry VIII's reign. He says that Richard directly ordered the murders and that a member of Richard's retinue carried them out, and Thomas More later claimed a similar thing. But, also, actually, some people have claimed that maybe it was even Henry VII who had the boys murdered, although that does seem to be tricky to sustain. The most likely thing probably is that they were killed in the autumn of 1483, and that it was on Richard's orders, maybe by Buckingham or someone else. Certainly the rumour of that was hugely damaging for Richard. It was seen as being a step beyond regular murder, and even that wasn't seen as being great, and that's certainly a step beyond killing someone in battle or judiciously. It might have led to Buckingham's rebellion. One of the theories of why Buckingham rebelled against Richard, despite having been an ally, a strong ally, so little time before, is that Buckingham disapproved of the decision to murder the boys. But we just don't know. Buckingham, incidentally, had been quite a curious absentee from Edward's court, and that might well have led to him plotting with Richard and supporting him all the way to usurpation, rather than just as becoming protector. And maybe Buckingham's subsequent rebellion against Richard, shows that Edward IV had been quite wise, and that Buckingham was someone who was quite erratic and headstrong and ambitious. So we don't know why he rebels, but he does. In October 1483, his aim is to put Henry Tudor on the throne. And this, of course, suggests very strongly that there was already a widespread belief that Edward V was dead. Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had plotted with Elizabeth Woodville for Henry to marry her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter, that is, of Edward IV as well. This would strengthen Henry Tudor's claim, which was a bit tenuous, and would certainly make him much more appealing to the Yorkists, rather than just the few Lancastrian nobility that were still around. That deal also, though, I think suggests that Elizabeth Woodville thought that her sons were dead. Anyhow, in October 1483, there was a series of rebellions in the south, which had always been less supportive of Richard. Best example of that is in Kent, where it was put down by John, Lord Howard, who as a result became Duke of Norfolk. The most serious of the rebellions, though, was that of Buckingham in South Wales. He was a cousin of Henry Tudor, family link. Perhaps he was after the throne himself. He had quite a tenuous, but still, still plausible link to the throne. On the 3rd of November, Henry Tudor was proclaimed king by the rebels, and was supposed to be coming ashore from Brittany, but bad weather meant that his crossing was delayed, and then Richard's defences in Devon and Dorset undermined their ability to land, and he was forced back up across the Channel. Buckingham's rebellion was dealt with pretty straightforwardly, and he was executed in Salisbury, but the rising as a whole and the coordination of it show that support for Richard was fragile, superficial perhaps, and it advertised the alternative to him, that there was one across the sea. About 400 exiles joined Henry Tudor as a result. And Richard, sensibly perhaps, tried to bolster his position afterwards by taking land from the rebels and giving it to his supporters, but unfortunately those supporters were from the north. They were outsiders, and it just sort of served to reinforce the fact that he seemed like someone who was imposing himself on the throne rather than succeeding to the throne, particularly in the south. Just before we contrast Richard and Edward, just a couple of things, family things to note, and these are both kind of tragic things that I guess perhaps feed into a sense of Richard being an unlucky king. His son, Edward, died in April of 1484. Aged 10, maybe more likely 7. I'm not quite sure when he was born. And the sources say 1473, but they don't seem all that certain about that. It's probably 1476, which would make him 7. Either way, he died. He wasn't an adult. He was known as a sickly child. It was natural causes. Both parents were distraught, but it does remove the stability of having an heir there, and it makes Richard's position that little bit less stable than it had been. And it was tragically followed up the following year by the death of Anne Neville in March 1485 from tuberculosis. Richard, again, very upset, wept at the funeral. Even so, some people still claimed that he had poisoned Anne so that he could marry Elizabeth of York and sew up kind of the legitimacy of his position. That probably says more about Richard's lack of popularity, I think, than about what actually happened. But there we go. So let's have a little think about contrasting Richard and Edward. First of all, it would be fair to say that in 1470s, Edward faced no threat to his position other than his brother Clarence, and even he wasn't really a threat to his position, it was just a bit of an irritation. Whereas Richard had both Buckingham and then Henry Tudor within the first couple of years. But before we sort of get carried away, remember that back in the 1460s, Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou were a real menace to Edward. And then in the late 1460s, Warwick and Henry and Margaret were a continued threat to him. So both Richard and Edward faced threats, but by the second half of his reign, certainly Edward was having a more stable and straightforward time. Although that said, Henry Tudor was never dealt with, which allowed him to become a threat to Richard III, but for Edward he wasn't much of a threat. Secondly, Edward had secure control of the country, partly because of Richard in the north and Anthony Woodville in Wales. Richard just doesn't have that same control over the country. See Buckingham's rebellion and the concurrent risings in the south. In particular, it's the south that causes Richard some headaches. Thirdly, Richard agreed a truce with the Scots in 1484, and Edward had also had a truce with the Scots. So this is truce with the Scots, and that is obviously a similarity. Both of them also had fractious relations with the French, who aid Henry Tudor. Richard probably didn't help himself out there with his naval attacks on the French in the 1484. Edward, on the other hand, certainly kept things calm with the French at the start of his reign, before his invasion in 1475. So until he was more secured domestically, Edward plays things with more caution, I guess. Next, it'd be fair, well, just a reminder, Richard does actually persuade Elizabeth Woodville to leave her sanctuary in Westminster Abbey by promising to find husbands for her daughters in March 1484. And this led to some measure of reconciliation with the family. Incidentally, though, this is where the rumour comes from that Elizabeth of York was being lined up as a next wife for Richard. However, it would be fair to say that both Richard and Edward have trouble because of their relationship with Elizabeth Woodville. For Edward, it becomes kind of the Woodvilles are everywhere, and she was a wife that didn't really bring the kudos that people expected or hoped for. And for Richard, it was kind of what you do with the Woodville family. So perhaps the Woodville family are a problem for both of them. Edward was more successful militarily as a king than Richard, although ironically, of course, Richard helps him be successful militarily as a king. Both, though, could be seen in similar vein as being good commanders and brave in the actual battles themselves. As I've mentioned already, Richard's heir died in 1484, which is a big problem for him, whereas Edward's heir had helped consolidate his position, although, that said, he's not old enough to stop those problems becoming real when Edward died. So both of them perhaps struggle for the idea of what's going to happen if he dies straight away. As I said, when Anne Neville died, there were rumours that Richard had poisoned her because he wanted to marry Elizabeth of York, and that damaged his reputation in the north, where the Nevilles were a very prominent family. Richard's reputation was already quite poor in the south, and his reputation suffers because of the other executions, and in particular the execution of the princes. Edward, on the other hand, had largely a pretty good reputation. People were sympathetic and empathetic to him. There was disquiet over the execution of Clarence, and he did, it is true, have Henry VI murdered, but seems to have got away with that because Henry VI had been a poor king and he was secured his position by then. That wasn't until 1471. Finally, both Richard and Edward had financial difficulties. Edward inherited a poor position from Henry VI because of the Hundred Years' War, because of Henry's poor use of patronage and also a trade recession. He improved that, but not without struggle, it's fair to say, and he was helped in 1475 and the years after with the Treaty of Picquigny, which gave him that £10,000 a year from the French. Nevertheless, Edward was seen as being extravagant with his personal expenditure, and when Richard became king, the royal treasury was empty. In fact, Richard had to pay £800 of his own money in June 1483 to offset expenses in the royal household, but this before he'd even become king. However, Richard didn't collect taxes and was careful not to make any financial demands until he really had to in 1485 because of the invasion of Henry Tudor, when he requested loans, not gifts, what were called benevolences, because he had promised not to do them. So both of them struggle with the finances of England because of the problems at the time. Overall, it's hard to compare them because Richard's reign is so short, and that makes it a failure, whereas Edward's reign was long. But I think there's probably more similarities there than you might think. It's just that in those early years, Edward is really able to stabilise things and get them under control, partly because of Warwick being on his side, whereas Richard really lacks that support in those first couple of years, and instead faces Henry Tudor, but faces him with kind of an ambivalence about his reign and his legitimacy, as we'll see next time. Thanks for watching. See you then.